As if surviving a shipwreck and facing possible starvation and dehydration wasn't enough, the survivors found themselves under the command of a ruthless dictator. The man exacted his revenge against the innocents, shaping this community to be what he wanted it to be. Should things go according to his plans, many of these survivors wouldn't see the next morning. Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. Thank you so much to our lovely officers and captains for suggesting this ship for this month's Members' Choice episode. As soon as I started reading into this one, I knew it would be a story that would capture my attention. The amount of shock, disgust, and scandal just makes it almost impossible to believe this is a true story. And without any further ado, let's get into it. It's important to note that during the 16th and 17th centuries, the Dutch were the major shipbuilders of Northern Europe. Batavia was just one of these innovative vessels called a fluyt, or fluyt. She was one of two ships specified in the Dutch East India Company's shipbuilding charter of March 29, 1626. It normally took about 18 months to build ships like these, so a small delay would fit these dates perfectly. The name Batavia was christened to her on June 29, 1628. The leaders of the Dutch East India Company pushed for her to be ready for the next fleet, which consisted of 5 other ships and was due to leave in September or October of 1628. Batavia was to be the flagship of this fleet. Before we get any further into her story, let's look at her specs. Now, this is an older vessel, so what we know is limited. We know she was a fluyt or East Indiaman, which was a type of Dutch sailing ship of carvel construction, with her tonnage sitting at 600 tons. She was 149 feet long, had a beam of 33.4 feet wide, and her hold was 17.9 feet deep. She was fully rigged, meaning she had 3 or more masts and all of them were square rigged. With this setup, she averaged speeds of 5 knots. As for capacity, she could carry 341 passengers and crew. For defense, she had at least 22 cast iron cannons, 6 bronze cannons, and 2 composite. For her time, she was a beast of engineering. But she's nothing like the modern ships we are used to. If you are enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comments section below. Okay, my friends, let's get into her maiden voyage. On October 29, 1628, the newly built Batavia sailed from Texel in the Netherlands for the Dutch East Indies to obtain spices. Their orders were to use the Brouwer route, like all ships of the Dutch East India Company. This involved sailing to the south of a direct course to Jakarta, but without any way of measuring longitude, it was difficult to judge when to make the turn north. A late turn gave the risk of running aground on the coast of Australia. She was under the command of Commander and Senior Merchant Francisco Pelsaert, with Arian Jacobs serving as skipper. Pelsaert and Jacobs knew one another prior to this voyage, as they'd encountered one another previously in Dutch Surat. Here, Pelsaert publicly dressed down Jacobs after he became drunk and insulted Pelsaert in front of other merchants. To say the least, there was bad blood between the two of them after this incident, and it's well documented. On board was also the junior merchant Geronimus Cornelitz, age 30, a bankrupt apothecary from Haarlem who was fleeing the Netherlands, in fear of arrest because of his heretical beliefs associated with the painter Johannes van der Beek. According to Pelsaert's account, Jacobs and Cornelitz conceived a plan to take the ship during the voyage, meaning a mutiny, which would allow them to start a new life elsewhere, using the huge supply of trade gold and silver on board. After leaving the Cape of Good Hope, where they had stopped for supplies, Jacobs is alleged by Pelsaert to have deliberately steered the ship off course and away from the rest of the fleet. Jacobs and Cornelitz had already gathered a small group of men around them and arranged an incident from which the mutiny would ensue. I'm warning you, it's quite graphic, and to protect my channel and content on this platform, I have to abbreviate the term, so I apologize in advance. This plot involved the SA of a prominent young female passenger, Lucretia Jans, in order to provoke Pelsaert into disciplining the crew. SA is unwanted physical contact, if you catch my drift. They hoped to paint Pelsaert's discipline as unfair and recruit more members out of sympathy. However, Lucretia Jans couldn't identify her attackers, so this disgusting plan flopped. On June 4, 1629, Batavia struck Morning Reef near Beacon Island, part of the Houtman Abrolhos off the western coast of Australia. Of the 322 aboard, most of the passengers and crew managed to get ashore, though 40 people drowned. During this time period, and even up into the mid-19th century, it was not common for people to know how to swim. The survivors, including all of the women and children, were then transferred to nearby islands in the ship's longboat and yawl. An initial survey of the islands found no fresh water and only limited food, like sea lions and birds. Pelsaert realized the dire situation and decided to search for water on the mainland. A group consisting of Jacobs, Pelsaert, senior officers, a few crew members, and some passengers left the wreck site in a 30-foot longboat in search of drinking water. After an unsuccessful search for water on the mainland, they left the other survivors and headed north in a dangerous voyage to the city of Batavia, Dutch East Indies, to seek rescue. En route, the crew made further forays onto the mainland to search for fresh water. In his journal, Pelsaert stated that on June 15, 1629, they sailed through a channel between a reef and the coast, finding an opening around midday at a latitude guessed to be about 23 degrees south, where they were able to land, and water was located. The group spent the night on land, and Pelsaert commented on the vast number of termite mounds in the vicinity and the plague of flies that afflicted them. Pelsaert stated that they continued north with the intention of finding the, quote, River of Jacob Reminiscence, identified first in 1622, but owing to the wind were unable to land. Historian Henrietta Drake Brockman has suggested that this location is to be identified with Yardie Creek. It wasn't until the longboat reached the island of Nusa Kambangan in the Dutch East Indies that Pelsaert and the others found more water. The journey took 33 days, with everyone surviving. After their arrival in Batavia, the boatswain, Jan Everts, was arrested and executed for negligence and, quote, outrageous behavior before the loss of the ship. He was suspected to have been involved in the mutiny. Jacobs was also arrested for negligence, but his culpability in the potential mutiny was not guessed by Pelsaert. Governor General Jan Pieter Zoon Cohen immediately gave Pelsaert the command of Sardam to rescue the other survivors as well as to attempt to salvage riches from Batavia's wreckage. Within a month, Pelsaert reached the general area where the shipwreck had occurred, but it took another month of searching to locate the islands again. He finally arrived at the site only to discover that a massacre had taken place among the survivors, reducing their number by at least 100. Cornelius was one of the few men that stayed on Batavia to pillage and steal. He was one of the few who survived the final breakup of the ship and made it to Beacon Island after floating for 2 days. Though neither a soldier nor a sailor, Cornelius was elected to be in charge of the survivors due to his senior rank in the Dutch East India Company. He made plans to hijack any rescue ship that might return and use the ship to seek another safe haven. Cornelius made far-fetched plans to start a new kingdom, using the gold and silver from the wreck. However, to carry out his plan, he first needed to eliminate possible opponents. Not all stories have such a clear-cut villain, but this one does. Cornelius' first deliberate act was to have all weapons and food supplies commandeered and placed under his control. He then moved a group of soldiers, led by Weeb Hayes, to nearby West Wallaby Island, under the pretense of having them search for water. They were told to send smoke signals when they found water, and then they would be rescued. Convinced that they would fail and perish, Cornelius left them to die, taking complete control of the remaining survivors. When it comes to the massacre, Cornelius never soiled his hands himself, other than when he tried and failed to poison an infant, who was unfortunately later dispatched. Instead, he coerced others into doing it for him, usually under the pretense that the victim had committed a crime such as theft. Cornelius and his henchmen had originally destroyed others to save themselves, but now they liked it. He planned to reduce the population to around 45 so that their supplies would last as long as possible. He also feared that many of the survivors still remained loyal to the Dutch East India Company. In total, his men killed at least 110 men, women, and children. As if this wasn't bad enough, he kept a small number of women as slaves for pleasure, if you know what I mean, with Lucretia Jans being kept just for himself. This was absolutely heinous, and don't worry, it will catch up to him. Remember those soldiers that Cornelius had left to die? Well, they did find food and water on West Wallaby Island. Initially, they were unaware of the massacres taking place and sent pre-arranged smoke signals announcing their finds. However, they soon learned of the horrors taking place from survivors fleeing Beacon Island. In response, the soldiers made makeshift weapons from materials washed up from the wreck. They also set a watch so that they were ready for Cornelius' men and built a small fort out of limestone and coral blocks. Cornelius and his goons were running low on water on his island, so he jumped on the opportunity to get water from the soldiers. He feared that the soldiers would hinder his success or that a rescue ship would spot them first, so he sent his men to eliminate the threat. But the trained soldiers were by now much better fed than Cornelius' group and easily defeated them in several battles. Seeking to bring Hayes under his command, he traveled to the island himself, where he was taken hostage. The men who escaped regrouped under soldier Waterloos and tried to attack again, this time using muskets to fire upon Hayes' fort, and they almost won. However, Hayes' men were on the right side of history, and they prevailed, just as Sardam arrived. A race to the rescue ship ensued between Cornelius' men and the soldiers. Hayes reached the ship first and was able to present his side of the story to Poolside. After a short battle, the combined force captured all of Cornelius' group. Poolside ended up deciding to conduct a trial on the islands, since Sardam on the return voyage to Batavia would have been overcrowded with both survivors and prisoners. After a brief trial, the worst offenders were taken to Seal Island and executed. Cornelius and several of his henchmen had both of their hands removed prior to hanging. Luz and a cabin boy, Jan Pelgrim de Bay, were considered only minor offenders, and so they were marooned on mainland Australia, never to be heard from again. This made them the first Europeans to have permanently lived on the Australian continent. This location is now thought to be Witakara Creek near Kalbarri, Western Australia, though another suggestion is nearby Port Gregory. The rest of Cornelius' henchmen were taken to Batavia for trial. 5 were hanged, while several others were flogged, keel-hauled, or dropped from the yardarm on the later voyage back home. Cornelius' second-in-command, Jacob Pieterts, was broken on the wheel, the most severe punishment at the time. Jacobs, despite being tortured, did not confess to his part in plotting the mutiny and escaped execution due to lack of evidence. What finally became of him is unknown, though he might have passed away in prison in Batavia. A board of inquiry decided that Poolside had exercised a lack of authority and was therefore partly responsible for what had happened. His financial assets were seized, and he died within the year of disease. His journals on the matter would be published in 1647 and widely read, spreading knowledge of the dangers of the coast of Western Australia. Hayes was hailed a hero and promoted to sergeant, which increased his salary, while those who had been under his command were promoted to the rank of corporal. Of the original 332 people on board Batavia, only 122 made it to the port of Batavia in the Dutch East Indies. Sardam eventually sailed home with most of the treasure previously carried on Batavia. Of the 12 treasure chests that were originally on board, 10 were recovered and taken aboard Sardam. Finally, for the survivors, it was over. But what happened to the Batavia? Thank you so much to our amazing YouTube members and patrons. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Alright, let's look at her wreckage. While surveying the northwest coast of the Abrolhos Islands for the British Admiralty in April of 1840, more than 200 years later, Captain John Lort Stokes reported that, quote, the beams of a large vessel were discovered, first assumed to be Zwick, quote, on the southwest point of an island, reminding them that since Zwick's crew, quote, reported having seen a wreck of a ship on this part, there is little doubt that the remains were those of the Batavia. That would be very eerie to stumble upon, knowing the atrocities that took place. In the 1950s, historian Henrietta Drake Brockham argued, from extensive archival research, that the Batavia wreck must lie in the Wallaby group of islands. The wreck was first sighted in 1963 by lobster fisherman David Johnson. Later in the 1970s, an archaeological investigation was carried out. Most of the excavation work was carried out over 4 years, starting in 1972. A large amount of the surviving hull was raised and conserved. This is about 20 tons of timber, which is about 3.5% of the ship's original hull. Other large items, including portside stern timbers, cannons, and an anchor, were salvaged. A large selection of smaller items were excavated, with many pottery containers, weapons, cooking equipment, navigation items, as well as various trade items from the ship's cargo. In 1972, the Dutch government transferred rights to Dutch shipwrecks in Australian waters to the Australian government. Excavated items are on display at the Western Australia Museum's various locations, though the majority of cannons and anchors have been left in situ. The wreck remains one of the premier diving sites on the Western Australian coast. A Batavia ship replica was built from 1985 to 1995, using the same materials and methods utilized in the early 17th century. Her design was based on contemporary accounts, recovered wreckage, and other contemporary ships like the Vasa. After a number of commemorative voyages, the ship is now moored as a museum ship in Lelystad in the Netherlands. This ship story had shipwreck, scandal, and massacre, leading to a gut-wrenching tale that is difficult to believe even all of these years later. In spite of this was a real story, and thus the victims deserve respect. Rest in peace to the victims of the shipwreck and mutiny of Batavia. May we never forget their stories. Beside her sister ship in battle, the Japanese battle cruiser struggled against the intense American onslaught. They were laser-focused on her, with shell after shell and torpedo after torpedo being lobbed her way. She was impressive as she was built, but as she sat in battle, her failures and technological advancements were made blatantly obvious. In next week's episode of Shipwreck Sunday, we get into the fate of the Imperial Japanese battlecruiser Hiei.